Good evening, gentlemen, good afternoon, gentlewomen, and also good morning, gentle children. Please go to school. Today is January the 13th, and we are having our weekly update to the situation in Vault of the Incarnates in the raid when it comes to specs meta, the rankings, the situation in the raid, how things have been going since the last time we looked at things, which was about 9 or so days ago. So, since we have nothing too interesting to point out that happened in history, we can just skip the intro immediately and go straight into looking at what is changing in the raid. Starting from the popularity of the specs, you can see that this was last week, this was the last time we checked, and this one is the new updated version as of today. Now, at first it might look quite boring, it might look quite uninteresting because you see most of the specs more or less in the same placement, in the same situation as before, right? However, I am going to direct you to look a little bit closer at the numbers, because what is interesting about this change in popularity is how much the specs have been growing from one week to the next. For example, if you look at Demonology Warlock, they went from 10,000 parses to 20,000. But if you look at Affliction and Destruction, for example, yes, they are both still at the bottom. Yes, they don't seem that much more played. But Affliction goes from 400 logs to 2,600, and Destruction goes from 668 to 3,100, which means that while Demonology doubled its play rate numbers, Affliction increased by 6 times and Destruction increased by 5 times as much. This is telling us that these two specs are getting played much more than last week. Even though their position looks to be the same, there is a significant difference. You can find this type of change in many other specs. For example, Marksmanship. Marksmanship doubles in number from last week to this week, but Beast Mastery Hunter more than triples its numbers. Even though the positions in the chart of these two specs stays the same, the numbers are quite different. Unholy and Frost Decay are the same. Frost Decay doesn't even double its numbers after a full week. Frost Decay goes from 2.3k to 3.6, so it's like 66% more at best. Meanwhile, Unholy Death Knight more than triples its numbers. The same can be said for the Warriors. Fury goes from 7 to 14,000, so again, they double their numbers, but Arms Warrior goes from 700 to 3,000. So again, they more than quadruple their play rate numbers over the course of a week. That is why I thought was worth pointing out, because if I just showed you these two charts, you just would have said, oh well, this is just exactly the same, nothing has been changing over the course of a week, it's just the same specs being meta and the other specs being much less played. Actually, no. Actually, we do have quite some changes in the play rate. Now, this might be due to the hotfix buffs that we have seen a few days ago, because, for example, Destruction, for example, Affliction are amongst the specs that have received buffs recently. We also had Arms Warrior receiving buffs, we had Retribution Paladin receiving buffs. Both of the other mage specs, Fire and Frost Mage, also were receiving buffs, etc, etc. So it is interesting to be keeping track of how these specs are being played, how much of the specs are being played from one week to the next as we go through balance changes applied by Blizzard. Now, these are the DPS specs. When it comes to tanks, as usual, there is much less of a change. We still have Protection Warrior as the standout winner of the tanks, followed by Blood Death Knight. This has been the state of tanks since the start of the tier, and not much is changing. For healers, we have the continuation of what we checked last week. Preservation Evoker is still ahead, and now it's a little bit further ahead than Restoration Druid. Even then, Restoration Druid and the two holy specs are still much further up than the 3 specs at the bottom: Restoration Shaman, Mistweaver Monk, and Discipline Priest. This seems to be the meta when it comes to healers, much more clear than the one for the DPS. You have the 4 specs at the top and the 3 specs at the bottom. It's much more obvious when it comes to healers. Talking about the performances, that's another juicy stat to go over. So, compared to last week, how many significant enough, we can say, changes there have been? So, when it comes to the overall graph, the overall damage numbers, we do have a few changes. First of all, Arcane Mage is much higher than before. Last week, Arcane Mage dropped below the middle, went to join the bottom half. Now it's the second better performing overall ranged DPS spec below Marksmanship Hunter. That's the first change we can see this week. There are not too many changes at the top. We still have two of the rogue specs being the better performing ones. Unholy Death Knight is still there. Enhancement, Havoc are still there. There is a slight growth of Frost Death Knight, which was already towards the top to begin with. Now it breaks into the top 4 for this week, as well as not too many changes in the bottom either. The only other major change is Demonology Warlock, which has continued to fall down overall compared to last week. It used to be towards the top 5, then it used to be in the top half, then it was in the middle, and now it's in the bottom half. In fact, at the moment it's down to being the 7th worst performing spec in the raid. But as I said, this is just the overall ranking. It's something that you just group all together. For example, Primal Council is specifically about AoE damage, so you will find many specs with good consistent AoE damage to log towards the top. So Balance, Marksmanship, Feral Druid, Subtlety Rogue, Shadow Priest are the specs that go towards the top. Then you move away from that and you go to something much more single target focused like Taros, which is just a single enemy to damage, and Unholy Death Knight is at the top. Even Survival Hunter out of nowhere is at the top. Assassination, a premier single target spec, also breaks into the top of the performance. Arms Warrior, also a good single target spec, is doing quite well on Taros. You have other types of damage profiles like Sennart, which is a consistent single target cleave damage on a second priority add. It's again Unholy being quite powerful. You also have out of nowhere both of the mage specs doing very well on Sennart. That's why looking at the overall rankings can be quite deceiving, because they just clump together several different bosses where also padding damage, doing a lot of AoE damage on some less meaningful targets. The adds on Eranog are not that relevant. The adds that spawn, the small adds that spawn on Sennart, the adds that spawn on Korogrim Totem as well, are not super relevant to do damage with, so several specs can pad their numbers in there and look much better than they actually are when you look at the overall rankings. Which is why when you look at things like the tier lists from Subcreation, which don't just take into account the logs for each boss, but also take into account, for example, how many of the specs have been playing in each of the encounters, how many of them, you will find results like these. The DPS tier list for the ranged, which sees the currently best performing range spec, if you just look at the logs, if you just look at the rankings of the logs, which is Marksmanship Hunter, be all the way down to a mediocre C tier, while other specs that weren't at the top in the logs, like Devastation Evoker, Balanced Druid, or even Beast Mastery Hunter, being rated much more highly at the moment. Same can be said for the DPS tier list for the melee DPS, where Unholy, which is now currently very, very high, together with Frost Death Knight, are just in the B tier right now, with Havoc, Demon Hunter, or even Fury Warrior and Windwalker Monk being higher up than those two specs. These rankings also get affected a lot by the progress of the guilds, because right now, of course, we are not on farm. Right now we are getting more and more guilds progressing through the raid, which means as the time goes by, we're gonna have more and more entries on kills of bosses like Kurog, and then bosses like Dathia, and then in a few weeks we will get more and more kills of Diurna, until eventually we get the kills of Razagat. So at the moment, for example, you have more and more guilds killing Kurog. Kurog has a lot of AoE, Kurog has a lot of padding, a lot of cleaving down, so specs like Frost Death Knight and Outlaw Rogue and Windwalker Monk are growing because there are more and more guilds killing Kurog, and since Kurog is very good for Frost DK, for Outlaw and for Windwalker, their overall ranking will rise. Then maybe once more guilds start killing Dathia, then the overall rankings will change based on which of these specs were the best for Dathia, for example. So at the moment, our overall rankings are still very susceptible to which types of bosses are being progressed by the guilds. Since at the moment we have it pretty much down on lock, who is good on Eranog, on Primal Council and on Terros. These bosses are quite known by now, but we're still not quite filled in with the rest of the bosses of the raid when it comes to, at the very least, mythic difficulty. Another thing we looked at last time was the boss difficulty, TLDR. How was the progression going on the different bosses? One thing that is still quite funny to look at is the kill percentage, and you will find that, for example, Kurog Green Totem is at a much lower kill percentage than Dathia. Even though there are currently more kills of Kurog than there are of Dathia, and also, as you can see for yourself, the amount of parses of Kurog are more than twice as many as the parses of Dathia. In fact, even Diurna with much fewer parses of Kurog still has a higher kill chance than Kurog. This might be perhaps due to the very tight, the very high DPS check that you need to have for Kurog, and also relatively the very high HPS check you need to have for Kurog. So it's more likely that more guilds are banging their heads against the wall when fighting Kurog, whereas once they are done with Kurog and they get to Dathia, killing Dathia is relatively easier than killing Kurog. That might be perhaps the reason as to why the kill chance isn't flowing with the kill order of the bosses, and why exactly is a boss that is killed before another is still considered to be harder than the next. We have seen this before, of course, it has happened before. Remember, for example, something like the Guardian of the First Ones in Sanctum coming after Painsmith, just to name one, right? That has happened before in the raids. So with this last bit of stats out of the way, we have our weekly recap of how the situation has been going in the raid. Once again, we continue our updated view, which shows the majority of the dominance in the raid being taken by melee DPS. Once again, many of the specs we have mentioned being at the top, depending on the fight. We have mentioned specs like Outlaw, Subtlety, Assassination, Unholy, Frost, Enhancement, Havoc, Windwalker. So we have mentioned many melee DPS, and we haven't mentioned nearly as many ranged. We have mentioned Arcane Mage, we have mentioned Marksmanship Hunter being there mostly because they are padding, not because they are very powerful. We have mentioned a couple of the Warlock specs, but that's just because they are being played more, not because they are super powerful. We haven't even mentioned once specs like Devastation, specs like Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman, or Fire Mage, because they are bang average right now. So we are continuing to go through this melee-centric performance levels in the raid, which has been going on for quite a while. We will see likely tomorrow when we go through our updated weekly review of the Mythic Plus situation if things have been remaining the same there as well when it comes to melee DPS being overall more popular, overall more powerful compared to the range DPS, but at the moment this is the situation when it comes to the raid. So it's time to leave each other on this Friday, according to some researchers, being the start of the weekend. Of course, we can start by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and supporting myself and this channel. You can still support in other ways that don't include having to spend money. Liking and commenting down below as well as subscribing are just fine enough ways to show your support. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to get notified on whenever I go live on stream, for example. Although recently I have been MIA due to a worse than expected problem around my left cheek, which turns out wasn't actually a tooth pain problem, but something a little bit worse. So it's getting better, but we still have a few problems to sort out in there. But still, Twitter will be the best way to find out whenever I go live on my stream. Talking about my stream, I do stream, of course, on Twitch, generally starting from 10 p.m. Central European Time, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. With this done with, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, fuck. Stealth surprise nose hitch coming at the end of the video out of nowhere. What is this?